It's been a while since we've done an episode together.
I know, yeah.
Do you want to, I mean, you've been on my podcast before, but do you want to do a quick intro of yourself?
Sure, I guess. Is this mic okay? Does it sound all right?
You guess? Yeah, it sounds good.
Okay.
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, good. Yeah, all right. Well, hi, Megan. Thanks for having me. I'm Dave Ford. My background's in science. I have a doctorate in biochemistry, molecular biology, and right now I work as a director of project management for a drug development company. So I'm happy and excited to talk about any sort of scientific or medical mysteries on your podcast. I'm not an expert by any means, but I'm happy to share what I know.
Thanks, Dave. Mm-hmm. So what we're going to be talking about today, I mean, you could look at it as a mystery, or you could, I mean, some people might not, but I find it very interesting. And I'll explain why. So the episode we're doing tonight is about the origin of HIV/AIDS. Mm-hmm. And I never really thought too much about this as a mystery, and it's not the typical thing I would do, because I normally talk about missing persons and, unsolved homicides and like other mysterious phenomenon. But this, I actually stumbled upon some information not too long ago, and it prompted me to do more research into the topic. So I always thought of, HIV/AIDS, it appeared in the early 80s in the United States. And, it was a mystery in the beginning until research was done. And we are at obviously a much better place today. But the origin of it is interesting to me. And when I dived further into it, when I had divin into it, I found out some things I didn't know. So I'll say that. But I guess a good place to start, I think, is just to explain what HIV is. And since you are the scientist that you are, I thought you could go ahead and do that for our listeners.
Sure. First off, what do you know about what HIV is?
So I know it stands for human immunodeficiency virus. Mm-hmm. And it's the virus that causes AIDS, which is the acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And what I know about it is that it is a virus that attacks the body's immune system, rendering it basically, I don't want to say useless, because obviously modern medicine has come a long way, but it attacks the body's immune system, making it less capable or incapable of fighting off infections. And then other than that, I know basically like how it's transmitted, which we can get into. But I mean, that's kind of the gist of it.
Sure. I mean, you hit all the important points really about HIV and AIDS. HIV, it's a type of virus called a retrovirus. And so every virus works by infecting cells, and then it hijacks the cellular machinery. Instead of making cell stuff and allowing the cell to function, uses the cell machinery to make more viruses. And normally this kills the cell. And in most cases, and well, I should say many cases, the virus will just turn a cell into a virus factory. So the cell will not function at all. It'll just be infected virus factory. And then it will explode, releasing a bunch of new viruses, which will go on to do the same thing to other cells. Viruses they tend to be very cell specific. So usually there are only certain types of cells they infect, which is why certain viruses will infect your respiratory system or your immune system or your digestive system or something else. HIV, which causes AIDS, is a retrovirus. And a retrovirus works by actually taking its genetic material and inserting it into your DNA. And so it takes your DNA in your nucleus and it's able to package its own viral genome, which is all of the genetic material that makes up the information to make the virus, and puts it inside your nucleus with your other DNA, tricking the cell into basically focusing on that instead of expressing its own genes. And so retroviruses are particularly scary because, as opposed to other types of viruses that just kind of hang out outside the nucleus, where its genetic material uses genetic material outside the nucleus, by inserting it there, there's always a risk in some types of viruses that it will propagate. And so those cells will replicate and there'll be new virally infected cells. And if they get into your germline, into your eggs or your sperm, then you can pass those viruses down to your children. Fortunately / unfortunately, HIV is so virulent and cytotoxic, meaning it kills the cells, that it doesn't really have that strategy of long-term staying in there. It basically just goes to the nucleus, creates a bunch of new HIV, kills the cell, and moves on to the next target.
That's interesting. So you said so it can actually attack the sperm or the egg cell. Is that what you said?
Some retroviruses can get in the sperm or the egg cells. HIV isn't known to do that.
So when a mother passes HIV along to their child, that's because of the blood.
It's
because of blood, right?
The blood, it's because it could happen in utero while the child's developing. It could happen through breast milk, even though that's usually a low titer of virus in the breast milk. Any fluid that has a virus or infected cell in there and could pass on, which is basically blood, sexual fluids, and lesser extent, that'll pass it down from the mother to the child.
Okay, yeah, that was going to be my next question. How it's transferred or spread between people. So sexually, basically bodily fluids, but not saliva.
No, fortunately, it's not one of those easily transmissible viruses that'll be through coughing, sneezing, or even vomiting. If someone with HIV vomits on you, chances are you're still probably fine. It's mainly through blood and sexual fluids where you're going to see a lot of virus in there and also a lot of infected cells.
Okay. Yeah, not to get too off topic, but when I was growing up and I first learned about HIV, you probably remember this from just knowing me.
Your blood phobia?
Yeah, like this is the first memory I have of this issue that I have. But like when we were learning about HIV in like middle school, I just remember this crazy reaction I would have where I would start to get really warm and like panicky. And I had to like leave the room and I would almost faint.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only ever when HIV AIDS was discussed or like another like blood related illness. And anyway, that's kind of off topic, but why is it that the scariest things in life also fascinate us? I don't know.
I mean, it's sort of morbid fascination, right? We're always interested in the dangerous things and the things that could kill us or affect us in some way. That's why everybody loves like murder podcasts and things like that, right?
Yeah, well, this isn't a murder podcast. This is an Unsolved Mysteries podcast, just to clarify.
Probably a lot of those people were murdered.
Yeah, a good amount were. But, yeah. So, yeah, back to my phobia and my sort of reaction, my physiological reaction to learning about these things. I used to be so scared, like, what if I, would touch a surface that somebody else touched and they were bleeding and now I have it. But it's actually not that easy to transmit. Contrary to like what people believed when this was first learned about in the US.
Right. And even if you like took someone, I mean, this sounds gross, so bear with me. Even if you had someone's blood infected with HIV and you licked it, you probably still would not get the disease transmit to you, because it's more blood to blood or sex fluid to sex fluid, which is the direct transmission. It's kind of hard because there aren't a lot of opportunities where that happens, with the exception of sex, with the exception of blood transfusion or sharing needles. And of course, these are the main vectors for the virus.
Yeah, and like the stomach acid, right, would kind of be too harsh of an environment for the virus to survive in.
Yeah, the digestive tract is not great for, and also it really doesn't have a lot of cellular vectors there. It doesn't have its target cells in great quantities, and so it's not going to be able to latch onto something and create virus factories in a way that allow it to propagate itself. It'll just die off.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, this last personal anecdote, and then we can get further into the content. But I remember when I was in middle school, first learning about this, like I didn't understand why I was reacting the way I was reacting. So like I was attributing it to like a logical fear. And I was afraid to go to school to like keep hearing about this because of the reaction I would have, like the panicky like reaction I would have. And so like I would stay home from school and I like confided in my mom that I was scared about this. And I think she had like told my dad, and I just remember being home alone from school and my dad like pulling up in the driveway, and I looked out the window and I could just tell he was so mad. He like slammed the door. He's like, and he comes in, he's like, "What is this I hear that you're afraid of this?" And he's like, "Why do you think you have that?" Like, and he was like mad at me. He's like, "Megan, that's absurd." Like, and yeah, so that's just like, it was just one of those things. Like, I didn't understand it. Obviously now I'm older and I can logically understand why I had that reaction, or at least like that it was like what do you know about the vasovagal response or whatever?
Yeah.
That's apparently what it is. Will you explain what that is?
I mean, I'm no real expert in that, but it's just sort of you're panicking, and your body. It's hard for your body to understand in many ways logically what is a danger and what is not. And so, if you've got it convinced that something is a danger, then it will react like you are in danger and you must get out of here. So adrenaline, all that kind of thing. And if, as opposed to running from a tiger or something like that, where very clear present danger, you're in it, you're out of it, and then you're good, that doesn't happen in those sorts of situations. And so your body can stress itself out to exhaustion.
That's so interesting, because I feel like as somebody who's an anxious person, again, I feel like I'm getting off track, but this is the last thing I'll say. As somebody who's like an anxious person, I feel like I have those anxieties and I felt that stress, but the only thing that's caused the reaction where I would literally faint or almost faint is this blood, or like this association with blood-borne diseases. It's so interesting.
You're freaking out and your blood pressure drops, and then you're almost like, oh, you can't really function.
Yeah, and of course I don't understand that when I'm, like however old I was, and
right, of course.
I remember this other time. We don't have to talk about this, but like in health class, they were showing us like, oh, look at this. They showed us pictures of this person who was a drug user. Like they would shoot up with needles, and it showed like the track marks all over their arms and stuff. And I just remember, yeah, it must have been at that point my blood pressure like dropped, because I just started like, I just asked to leave, asked if I could go to the bathroom. I went into the hallway. I couldn't see clearly, like my vision was blurry, and I started falling into lockers.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's not relevant to the case, so we can go on. But anyway, I just find it interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
That since I learned about this, like that has, I don't know, it's been kind of a fascination, but also like a fear. So anyway, let's get to the reason why I wanted to talk about this. So, HIV, it's been studied. Obviously, we've come a long way from when this was first kind of discovered in the United States in the 80s. I think there's like drugs now where you can take an HIV positive person can take these drugs, and the virus is no longer even detectable in some cases. That's just a testament to how far modern medicine has come. But the reason I was interested in this, and we can talk about this now, is because I'm a frequent reader of the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Okay. And I stumbled upon this post from a while ago, 10 months ago to be particular. It was different than your normal, missing person, unsolved homicide, whatever. And it was about this kid, Robert Rayford, okay? And the title of the post is, "How did a 15-year-old from Missouri become the first alleged AIDS victim in 1969?" Okay? And so I started reading through this, and I found it interesting because, as far as I knew about HIV/AIDS, it broke out in the early 80s in the US as this mysterious new virus. And then as it was studied more was learned about it, et cetera. But where did it actually come from, right? We hear that it comes from primates, which we could talk about. But anyway, I thought we could talk about this Robert Rayford kid because I thought it was interesting.
Sure. Yeah. So as I understand it, AIDS was identified in the 80s. It had, well, I should say, more closely classified and really studied in the 80s. But there had been, before that, I think in the 70s, perhaps even the 60s, but probably the later 70s. I mean, it was obvious something was going on. And mostly it had been identified in the gay community in the U.S. and various gay communities in large cities in the U.S. And the fact that since it had really been observed at that point where you're seeing all these commonalities there suggests that obviously this isn't the origin. And so it had to have started somewhere in order to spread to all these different communities, these disparate communities in the U.S. And there are two very important things to keep in mind about AIDS, the disease, when people were first trying to actually detect and realize its existence. Number one is HIV has an incubation period. And so traditionally what happens is people are infected with HIV, they have flu-like symptoms, and then it goes away, which is really the virus just kind of, for lack of a better term, laying low in the body, propagating itself somewhat silently for a period of anywhere from a few years up to a decade or more, and then all of a sudden growing into a full-blown case of immunodeficiency of AIDS, where it's affecting these people. And so it's very difficult. It's very scary, absolutely, and also very difficult to connect the dots between infection and actual disease. Number two, it's a disease that's often, especially at that time, identified by the diseases, the opportunistic diseases that it leads to. Because the effects of AIDS is the fact, like you already explained, your immune system is shot. Specifically, your adaptive immune system, your ability to recognize and fight against pathogens that come into your body, or even cancers or other diseases that arise from your body in order to react to that. So since that is completely ineffectual, the people tend to suffer and die from the opportunistic diseases that arise there, respiratory diseases, cancers, various other things. And so when people are seeing these symptoms, they're not seeing symptoms of AIDS, they're seeing symptoms of diseases. And they're seeing symptoms all of a sudden like, hey, these diseases, these respiratory diseases that people are usually able to be sick for a month and then survive, all of these people in the gay communities in the US are dying from for some reason. There are these rare cancers that really don't arise that much or kind of starting to go away that are becoming really prevalent in gay communities. And so that was the first evidence that, okay, this is something that is affecting the immune system in these people. All of the evidence was so delayed and indirect, it was really hard in order to determine exactly where it came from and how.
I'm really glad you brought that up because that was going to be one of my next questions. Quick, yeah, I don't know if this is a dumb question, but yeah, so like what you were saying with like cancers and infections, they're saying like one of the like the common thing that was notable in HIV patients was clusters of Kaposi's sarcoma, which is a type of cancer, I guess like a skin cancer. And my question is, again, this might be really stupid, but whatever. I didn't associate cancers with the immune system. Is that wrong? I thought cancer was kind of a different thing. Go ahead.
It's technically wrong, but I mean, completely understand, because it's not super common knowledge about how important the immune system is for cancer. If you asked any cancer biologist or even someone who's somewhat involved in oncology, they'll tell you that right now the hottest thing in cancer therapeutics is immuno-oncology medicine, being able to actually help the immune system fight cancer. And the reason for that is normally in the body, whenever a cell starts becoming malignant, starts becoming, this could lead to cancer, the immune system usually is able to identify it and kill it. Like, cancer has been around as long as humanity's been around. And so our immune system has, and not just us, any sort of animals that suffer from malignant tumors. And so our adaptive immune systems are able to identify that and shut it down. Of course, there are the cases where they're not able to. And, we could spend a long time talking about all the ways that cancer is able to evade or trick the immune system. But the problem is when someone's immunodeficient, then cancerous cells that normally would get attacked and killed quickly and stopped in their tracks suddenly have room to proliferate. And the security, the cops aren't around anymore. And so they're able to take advantage of that situation, which is one of the reasons that those type of diseases are much more common in people with immunodeficiencies such as AIDS.
Okay, so again, at risk of sounding kind of silly, just to clarify, why then do healthy people who don't have immunocompromised diseases, how do those people get cancer?
Because the immune system isn't 100%. People die from diseases all the time. And a fully functional, really great immune system can get 99 out of 100 cells that may turn malignant, but that one cell could turn into a deadly cancer. I referred to this a little bit earlier, but it's arguably an evolutionary arms race between cancers and the immune system, where the immune system has a lot of mechanisms in order to detect malignant or pre-malignant cells and kill them. And then pre-malignant cells have a lot of mechanisms for evading that. For example, and not to really dive into it, one of the things that those cells do is there's a receptor on pretty much every type of cell that goes out and shows hey, these are the type of proteins that I'm making, or I'm healthy. And if the cell's infected by a virus or bacteria or becomes cancerous, the immune system will look at that protein on the outside of a cell with a receptor, and it'll say, okay, no, this cell's not looking good. I think I'm going to kill that cell. Cancer cells take those and take them away from the cell surface so that the immune system can't see them and can't see that they're malignant or there's something wrong with them. And there's a million other ways, I can't even get into it right now, that cancer cells are able to evade the immune system. So they're tricky. And so that's obviously why people with healthy immune systems suffer and die from cancer, but it's a lot worse with people without a functional immune system.
Got it. No, I appreciate the explanation because I actually didn't know that. So that's interesting. Okay, so the first actual reference to HIV, or not even before they had a name for it, was introduced in the United States on May 18th, 1981, via a gay newspaper called the New York Native. And it referred to this exotic virus, a new exotic virus that seemed to be affecting primarily the gay community. But I wanted to talk about Robert Rayford, if it now would be a good time. because this is what prompted my wanting to do this case. Because like I said, whenever I thought of HIV/AIDS, I thought the 80s, new virus. But there's some strong evidence, in my opinion, that there is this case from the 60s could have been like the earliest documented case of HIV. So I can go ahead and talk about that. All right, so there was this kid, Robert Rayford. He was 15 years old, and he was an African-American teenager living in St. Louis, Missouri. And this story starts when he checks himself into a hospital in early 1968 with some really concerning symptoms. He had lost weight. He had trouble breathing. He was thin. He was pale. And his genitals were covered in warts and sores. And he also had severely swollen testicles. And he actually told the doctors, which I found to be interesting, is that he had been suffering from these symptoms since at least 1966. So we're talking roughly 2 years. They discovered that Robert had a severe chlamydia infection that had spread throughout his body, which I guess that's kind of rare for that to happen. But anyway, so they discovered he had that. Interestingly, he refused a rectal exam. And doctors and hospital staff said, generally speaking, he was pretty withdrawn and kind of quiet. And they even thought maybe he was kind of developmentally slow. So yeah, they asked about his sexual history as a part of their, trying to figure out what was going on with him. And there was I guess he gave differing accounts at different times. But given that this is such an old case, it's hard to verify this. But apparently he told someone that he was, quote, the stud of all time. But then he told somebody else that his only sexual contact had been with a girl in the neighborhood. And he attributed these symptoms from that. He was in and out of the hospital for the next year. He kept getting sicker. And although he started to improve, I guess, late in 1968, his symptoms returned with a vengeance, and he ended up dying on May 15th, 1969 from pneumonia. So they did an autopsy of him. They found a bunch of lesions on his legs, which were determined to be Kaposi sarcoma. This is interesting. So this particular cancer was apparently pretty rare, and up until this point, it was seen in Ashkenazi Jewish men, primarily. Obviously, like I mentioned earlier, I mentioned Kaposi sarcoma. Later on, it would become associated with HIV. So anyway, why are they associating this kid with HIV? Because somebody had the presence of mind to freeze his tissue samples, I guess, for future research. And then when HIV became this huge deal in the United States, they went back and they did tests on his cells. In 1984, they did the first test, which ended up being negative. But in 1987, a different researcher used a more sensitive test called the blot test. Have you ever heard of this? The Western blot
test? Oh, Western blot. Yes. So Western blot identifies types of proteins that are found in a sample. Do you know anything about what the first test was?
Let's see. So it just says in 1984, tissue samples that belonged to Rayford were tested for evidence of HIV infection. And the result was negative. Now, this person that writes this speculates that it was an antibody test, but they can't find any record of what was actually tested.
Okay.
But it was in 1987, so 3 years later, they used the Western blot test, which was more sensitive. And they discovered antibodies for HIV.
Okay. Okay.
These findings were never peer reviewed because in 2005, the last known samples from him were destroyed in Hurricane Katrina. So further testing was no longer possible at this point. So let me ask you this. So Robert was this 15-year-old kid. He had chlamydia, but he had never left the Midwestern United States, and he at least told doctors he never got a blood transfusion. He had never been to New York, San Francisco, or LA, which we know now were the cities that would become the major center areas for HIV infection. So what do you make of this? What do you think is going on with this?
Well, operating on the assumption that he did have HIV or some, viral precursor to modern HIV, it's not too hard to believe. Obviously, he didn't go near any of the epicenters, but the epicenters became epicenters because the virus got out there, and then a lot of people were sharing needles and having sex with each other in a small community, and it became perfect hotbeds for viral propagation. It was, in all likelihood, before that, up to many years, maybe decades before that, there were viruses just from person to person in a much smaller way. People that had less sexual partners that did not share needles throughout the U.S. and from wherever it came before the U.S. And so it's quite possible that someone had sex with him who was HIV positive, or someone had sex with someone that he had sex with who was HIV positive. If that one quote attributed to him that is true, that he only had sex with that one neighborhood girl, she could have had it from someone else as well. And granted, we know nothing about her fate. We don't know whether she suffered from similar symptoms or died or was completely healthy. But it's completely possible that early on she just was a vector for it and transmitted it to him, or that he was raped, or that any number of things happened that we just, because his life is a black box that we don't really know. It's completely possible that it came through that small town to him. Not to make any judgments about him at all, but what we do know that he is, in the middle of the 20th century, rural, possibly developmentally delayed, come from a slightly, not a very affluent background. There are a lot of people that victimize those types of people as well. So anything is possible.
Yeah, and another thing to note is that St. Louis was the hub for Trans World Air at the time. So it was like a lot of travelers from all over the world came through the city. So that's worth noting. Also, what I want to know is, why didn't it blow up then around this time? If he was infected, say 66, 67, as he said, these symptoms started, why did we not see a big occurrence? This is my first question, then I have a second question, but I'll ask this one first. Why would it be that there wouldn't be people in this area in St. Louis that were around him, or this other girl or whoever, that we would see this mysterious illness then, and it came about in the 80s?
There are so many reasons. Three real, I guess, immediately obvious reasons would be, number one, this wasn't, it exploded in those areas because there was a lot of people having sex with each other and sharing needles with each other. And that was not happening likely in this kid's case, or the people that gave it to him. It was just straightforward one-to-one transmission. And so we don't see these big epicenters. You see isolated incidents that are hard to diagnose because these people aren't dying from AIDS. They're dying as people can see it, they're dying from tuberculosis or something else that's happened. Number two, viruses evolve. It's possible that, a couple decades before AIDS really became, what it's known as a modern disease, it could have acted and functioned slightly differently. It could have been not as virulent. It could have been easier to pass from one person to another without those people that are passing along really suffering from those symptoms. Number three, what we know about HIV is it has an incubation period, and that varies from person to person. So it's quite possible this guy, because he was 15 years old, so in all likelihood, he didn't have an incubation period of a decade. It's possible that he barely had an incubation period at all, or was just a small handful of years. And then other people that had infected him, or, hopefully not that he infected, had different incubation periods and then suffered symptoms much later on in life. Any of those things or all of those things could be possible.
Okay. Yeah, that's really, yeah. I thought this was fascinating because, like I said, I thought the first, sign of this was in the 80s until I started researching it more. And, obviously it came from somewhere.
Right. I mean, and we already talked about this, but it didn't pop up independently overnight in a matter of years at all these different places across the U.S. It came from somewhere and was spread, and then those places became perfect hotbeds just because of the environmental situation there. So it had a history. It definitely had a history before the 80s. It's just a lot harder to track.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, my next question, and it not to interrogate you, but I'm just curious if you know the answer to this. Why is it that this is in the beginning, this was considered a gay disease? Because we know now, this can be transmitted via heterosexual sex as well. So why did this primarily affect gay men at first? And was that just a coincidence, an unfortunate coincidence, or is that is it more common to transmit it that way?
Well, a couple things. Biologically, there's no reason why the virus would care if you're having gay sex, straight sex, or anything like that. That doesn't matter with the biology of the virus. Number two, even though it can be passed from man to man, man to woman, woman to man, woman to woman, any sort of which way through sexual fluids, it is a lot easier to transmit from man to man or man to woman, just because the man is depositing semen through unprotected sex. And so virally infected semen will be inside the body of the recipient. Whereas if someone has sex with a woman, yeah, they'll obviously interact with the vaginal fluids and be covered in various ways. It may get within the body, but it's a lot easier when you have virally infected fluid sitting inside of you, at least part of it, for it to transmit it to you than not. So it's easier for a man to pass it on than a woman to pass it on.
Right, but then by that logic, then wouldn't straight women, you know what I'm saying? Why wouldn't
from man to woman, yeah. But so there are a few factors that make it a perfect storm. I mean, obviously, in the 80s, it's nowhere near a perfect situation right now, but gay communities of gay men in the 80s were definitely considered deviant. They were definitely considered outside the norm. And so these were very insular communities. And at the same time, what happens when communities become deviant in society's eyes is that, number one, they're very insular. And number two, then they tend to be involved in other deviant activities just because of the confluence of deviancies, where if society rejects you, then you tend to be involved in other things that society rejects. And so there's more drug use, there's more needle use, there's a lot of unprotected sex just because, these are our communities. This is what we're doing. This is these are our lives. And so because of that, it is, if there's one infected gay guy that arrives at a city and then has sex with someone else and has sex with three other people, and those people have sex with three other people, and it goes around and around within the same community, that is not say anything else about sharing needles or drug use. This was happening at the time. This was the 80s after all. It's the perfect petri dish for this virus to really replicate here.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so here's another interesting thing that I stumbled upon in my research. And it's interesting because, when I was growing up and we were learning about HIV, Africa it's pretty well known, I think, that Africa, which is, it's a continent, so there are certain regions more than others, but there's a huge problem with HIV in Africa. And that could be because of poor, unsanitary medical conditions, I think is one of the reasons. But I started looking into the history of that. And so I found that the earliest known sample of HIV in a human is from 1959. And it was from a man that died in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kinshasa, to be specific, which I found interesting. So, why wasn't it identified then? I'm just trying to understand, if this was prevalent or it existed before the 80s, why is it the 80s that this seemed to blow up? And then it was all this research was done and they discovered this. You know what I'm saying? Why it wasn't it? Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think, like you're referring to, it's pretty well accepted right now that Africa is the origin of HIV, where the non-human primate virus that existed at the time made the leap into humans and then mutated into what eventually became modern HIV. So there are a number of factors why, this wasn't identified, even though I'm sure it was going around at various places in Africa at the time. The most obvious thing, to address the elephant in the room, that people didn't care. Epidemiologists and people who would study this don't care about something that's going around Africa because there's always something about Africa in their eyes. And as long as it's not creating a huge disturbance, as long as it's this disease that may be passing along from one person to another sexually transmitted disease, another zoonotic, which means going from an animal to a human disease that pops up there, we're not going to really bother studying that. So once it gets into the U.S. and it's affecting the population there, in their eyes, more developed country, a first world country, then people start caring about it. Number two, in all likelihood, the virus at the time in the 50s or 60s in Africa, or even before it made that jump into those hotbeds in the U.S., was probably a very different virus into what it is today. We don't know that for sure. I don't think we have really samples and can study that. But it's quite possible that in its early life, after it made the first transition to humans, I'm sure was very dangerous and deadly, but perhaps it wasn't as transmissible. Perhaps it was something that could be recovered from. Maybe it wasn't as obvious. Number three, something that we refer to again and again, is the fact that this is really hard to identify for a number of reasons. It incubates. You don't see, everybody doesn't have, everybody's got the AIDS cough or something. No, other opportunistic diseases come in and take advantage of the fact that the immune system is shot. Because of that, it's hard to identify unless you're seeing a lot of it happening at once. And so, like we already talked about, the insular gay communities within metropolitan areas in the U.S. in the 80s were the perfect place for that to happen.
What is the AIDS cough?
No, there's not an AIDS cough. I was just referring to the fact there's not an obvious this person's got the AIDS cough or they've got little chicken pox everywhere. There's no obvious red flag that says, hey, these people are all suffering from the same disease that you can point to.
Got it. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. We can keep talking about this. The last thing I had on my list about this that I thought was worth bringing up. Have you heard of Gaetan Dugas?
No.
Okay, this is really interesting and also pretty sad. He was a French Canadian man. He was a flight attendant, and he was very early on within this epidemic. Found to have HIV. And he was actually attributed the label of patient zero. And I'm talking for years after this poor man died, he was like referred to as patient zero, but it was literally all a myth. Basically, it was like a study that was done in 1984, right? They were trying to figure out like his role in a particular cluster of different AIDS cases in the United States. And because he was from Canada, he was referred to as patient O. And apparently the O stood for out of California. But that was misunderstood to be patient zero. And so he was referred to patient zero in a book that was written in 1987 about the virus. But it's since been like debunked that he was patient zero, obviously. But this poor man like had to deal with, well, I mean, he died, but his legacy was kind of tarnished because of this. And I thought I could, if it's okay with you, play this quick 2-minute video just to get your reaction.
The myth of patient zero has been shattered. The Quebec man thought to be at the epicenter of the rise of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s has had his name cleared. CTV's Brian Dunstan here with that story. Brian, what is this study telling us about Gaetan Dugas?
Well, it's quite simply, it's telling us that 32 years after his death in 1984 from complications due to HIV/AIDS, Gaetan Dugas, the French-Canadian flight attendant tagged with the dubious moniker Patient Zero, has finally had his name cleared, and this time it looks like it's for good. A study published in the October issue of Nature magazine concludes that Dugas was not the source for introducing the virus to North America. Suspicions that Dugas was at the center of a network of sexual partners first came out in a study in the American Journal of Medicine back in 1984. This new research, authored by Michael Warabay from the University of Arizona and Richard McKay from the University of Cambridge, found that the location of the initial outbreak was New York City, not San Francisco as originally thought, and pinpointed that the AIDS virus had been circulating in U.S. borders since as far back as 1970. The new analysis also revealed that a sample of Mr. Dugas' blood taken in 1983 contained a viral strain that was previously infecting men in New York. Aaron?
Was there anything else that led the researchers to believe that Dugas was not patient zero?
Oh, absolutely. There were quite a few things in the study that debunked that claim, Aaron. Perhaps the most salient is this. The researchers also reported that originally, Mr. Dugas was not even called patient zero. He was designated patient O, as in the letter O, for outside Southern California. That's where the original study began. Someone mistakenly read the O as a zero. And the rest now, thanks to this latest study, is history, Aaron.
But this isn't the first time that patient zero tag has come under fire.
Not at all. No, Aaron. Back in November of 2007, an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that the HIV virus was introduced from Haiti to the United States in 1969. And that appeared to dismiss the patient zero hypothesis, but apparently that did not gain as much traction as this new one, the new study has. Aaron?
CTV's Brian Dunstan for us on this. Thanks, Brian.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I'd be interested in your reactions to that, but also like the Haiti thing. That's another thing I was going to bring up. But what are your thoughts on that? Is there anything to it besides, oh, that's unfortunate?
I mean, I'm glad that people are putting effort into demonstrating that this person isn't the patient zero. I mean, I've heard that before. Now that I didn't recognize the name when you said it when you told me the story, I remember hearing years ago, like, oh, this guy's patient zero. He was a French flight attendant or something like that. And so this is obviously what I was referring to. Clearly, it makes sense that he's not. So this was going around before that, and I'm glad that there's actual scientific evidence demonstrating. It's interesting that they brought up that it was introduced to the U.S. from Haiti, because when I was researching this very slightly before our conversation, I learned that one of the earlier terms for the virus before AIDS was arrived at is the 4-H disease.
I heard that too, yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember what the 4-H's were?
Because I researched it today, or I've been researching it very recently with the last, knowing we were going to do this. Homosexual, hemophiliac, but what is that? Because it's not Because that's not fear of blood, right?
Now, a hemophiliac is someone who really can't clot very well. And so if they are injured, then their body just keeps bleeding instead of healing, clotting and stopping it. And so these are hemophiliacs tend to need a lot of blood transfusions.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Because I read hemophiliac and I was like, I need to look that up because I forget what that means. And then Haitian, what was the
So needle sharing.
hypodermic needles? Yeah, okay.
Close. It was heroin. Heroin users was the fourth.
Oh, okay.
So obviously looking back on it, retroactively, clearly these are like where the vector can come in. And so homosexual through sex, hemophiliac through blood transfusion, heroin through sharing of needles, and then Haiti, apparently it had been a hotspot before actually being introduced to the U.S. And one of the facts that is not really well known just sort of demonstrates what we discussed earlier, where if it affects a poorer, less affluent country, then people care about it and people know it less. But when it becomes a hotbed in, a first world country, then people start caring.
So would you say it's kind of rooted in, is racism the right term, or is it more like
racism, classism, nationalism, all of it? Yeah, all of it is deeply entwined with each other. Sure.
Yeah, I feel sort of naive because, like I said, I always thought, oh yeah, 1980s, that's when AIDS started. And
that's not naive. That's what you were taught. That's what people talk about. People don't talk about the actual origin of the virus because, well, I mean, it doesn't really affect them. It affects them of when it happened in the U.S. And that's understandable.
Okay. So my next question is, like, we were talking about zoonosis, right? Did I say that right? Zoonosis?
Yeah, I think so.
How, and again, I'm not trying to sound ignorant or trying to be funny with this question, but how does a virus jump from, the SIV, right? The simian immuno, whatever the chimpanzee version is, SIV.
Mm-hmm.
How does that jump from? Is ape the right term?
Primate.
Primate.
Yeah.
How does that jump from primate to human? And does that mean, because I'm serious, I didn't make this up, but I've heard this before. People have said that means somebody must have been, with a primate, like a human and a primate.
Right. It's possible, but the fact is, operating on the assumption that SIV is transmitted through the exact same vectors as HIV, which I don't know whether that's true or not. It's possible that SIV could be somewhat present in the saliva or something else, or the urine or feces or anything. Assuming that is just blood and some breast milk and sexual fluids, then yeah, it's possible someone had sexual contact with a primate. It's possible that someone got into a fight with a primate and blood was exchanged. It's possible that a primate bit someone and they had bloody mouth or some other fluids in their mouth when they did that. So, I mean, it's a wild animal. You don't know what happened. There are other reasons that transmission could have occurred besides just having sex with a primate. In addition to that, just going back to our assumption, SIV may operate somewhat differently than HIV, especially that particular strain of SIV at that time. It's possible that it could have been transmitted by feces or urine or saliva or a bite or something else that's very direct that isn't necessarily sex with a primate.
Another theory that I read, or I guess, that I think it said that most scientists sort of agreed on the fact that, what bushmeat is?
Yeah, I've heard that term before, but I can't remember. What is it?
It's like bushmeat is meat from wildlife species that are hunted for human consumption.
Oh, okay.
And it's, I guess, it's a primary source of protein and a cash-earning commodity for inhabitants of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And it's an important source of food in poor communities. Anyway, so I was reading that it could be that could be a reason, or like how it would have jumped from primate to human populations.
I mean, I have a hard time believing that would be the main transmission there, especially if the meat was cooked or prepared in any way. Virus isn't going to survive that.
Yeah.
If it is, let's just say raw meat eaten, it's possible that bloody raw meat of an infected animal could, transmit the virus into a human. It could make that zoonotic leap from animal to human.
Yeah. So, is it possible? Is it important? Does it matter at this point how this started, or when it started, or who patient 0 was? Do you think? Or do you think what's important now is just moving forward and the progress that has been made with this?
I think that if you're talking about the value in the information in fighting the virus, I don't think there's much value in that information, because it could be useful historically to learn what happened, but that virus is not today's virus. We know how to fight today's virus and how to act, so it doesn't really matter how it got here. I think there are lessons involved in epidemiology and identifying things before they become major problems. I think there's, as opposed to where things were decades ago, I think there's a lot more epidemiological focus on Africa. I mean, I think some of the greatest epidemiologists and epidemiological research institutes are located in Africa right now, because that's where a lot of new diseases come from. And so some of that investment and funding is probably somewhat selfish from Western countries, because they want to identify and stop things there before it gets over to the Western countries. But I think the fact that, this wasn't caught and identified is just a study in what can go wrong. That's probably the greatest value of really learning more about it. Of course, not even talking about the personal stories. I mean, if someone whose loved one died from that, whether it was yesterday or whether it was in the 50s, will want to know exactly what happened. And so there is value in that as well.
Yeah, and I think it's really important what you were saying, which I had forgotten amongst all my research, that like you said, the incubation period and the fact that you can get these symptoms that you could think are the flu, and then years could pass before anything else re-emerges. That just makes it like so much more dangerous in terms of spreading it, right? So that's nobody's fault, but that's, a contributing factor, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough disease, and as much as people weren't looking at it, it was really hard to identify, even if you were looking at it. And it wasn't until it was blaring in people's faces in the US where people really were able to identify the pattern.
Yeah. So we can go ahead and wrap this up. I just have a few closing things.
Sure.
But I just stumbled upon Wikipedia. I like Wikipedia. I don't know why people are always hating on it, because people can edit it, right?
Yeah, well, Wikipedia is
legit.
good as long as you check the sources. That's the thing. Wikipedia is fantastic because it sources their material. You just have to go and see where the sources are and make sure the sources are valid and they agree. You can't just take it at face value.
I ain't got time for that.
Well, there's that.
I'm just kidding. Anyway, I stumbled upon a Wikipedia article, which is a timeline of early HIV/AIDS cases, which I'm going to have to take a glimpse at. But there's several documented cases listed here that date back to the 50s and 60s, which is fascinating. Like, David Carr, a Manchester printer, who died on August 31st, 1959, following failure of his immune system. He succumbed to pneumonia. Baffled by what he died from, doctors preserved 50 of his tissue samples for inspection. In 1990, the tissues were found to be HIV positive. Anyway, there's a bunch of different documented things on here, which I'm going to go read. But I'll also link that when I'm posting this episode, like for source material. This is just out of curiosity. What do you think are the biggest like myths about HIV AIDS, or what do you wish more people knew, or what do you think people would benefit from knowing about this virus? I mean, the treatments have gotten so much better, but still, knowledge is power.
True. I mean, I think that I'm hoping that in today's day and age, the same sort of misconceptions like, oh, it's a gay person's disease, straight people can't get it, or it's only through sex, like there's no other way to really get it, are kind of done away with. But, they're still prevalent. It's really hard to eradicate those types of things. There's still regulations barring gay men specifically, from donating blood. That's
crazy to me.
Originate from like AIDS epidemic time. And it's ridiculous in today's day and age where, a lot of people from all different communities have it and could have it. And they test for that type of thing in blood donation. There's no reason why that thing should still exist. I think obviously those misconceptions are something that should be eradicated. Number two, I think, like you were already referring to, modern antiretroviral medicines are very powerful. And if it is caught before it gets too severe, then it can be completely under control, and someone that is technically HIV positive, that has been infected, can live an entirely normal life under correct antiviral medication. Even if someone's further along in further developed, if not quite yet severe, AIDS disease, it can still be somewhat reversed from the types of therapies that I think that's the important thing. Something I want to bring up, and I think this is a good opportunity to do so. There are two interesting anecdotes about HIV therapeutic research. And so there was something really lucky about that research and something very unlucky. The very lucky thing was the fact that in mid to mid-late 20th century cancer research, a lot of researchers were operating on the assumption that the main driving force of cancer was retroviruses, which makes sense if you think about it. Retroviruses affect your DNA. They inject their genome, the genetic material, into your nucleus. And it can, in some retroviruses, it can be replicated into new cells, and some it can be passed down familially. And so people think, well, cancers through mutations, it can be passed down, but there's a lot of overlap here. Maybe retroviruses are really one of the main things that cause cancer. And so because of that, there was a big influx of antiretroviral therapeutic research. Let's learn more about retroviruses. Let's find out how we can fight them. And so eventually, when AIDS got the attention and funding necessary to focus research to develop therapeutics, they're able to build off of that knowledge base of retroviruses and how to fight them, where they got really a step up from their work. And they're able to get a little acceleration based on that. So that was working in their favor. The thing working against them was the fact that in the 80s, where people first started paying attention to this, it was the gay disease. And the powers that be did not care about any funding. In fact, it was quite the opposite. The Reagan administration and other related officials not only did not care about enough, it was to their benefit to let people in the gay community suffer, because they were seen as social deviants. They were people that did not agree with their administration. They were people that did not conform to the way that they think that people should live. And so if they're dying, well, that's what happens. And that's really goes into why some people still believe, and a lot of people at the time said, like, oh, this is God's judgment on gay people, is AIDS. It's ridiculous for so many reasons. But the powers that be at that time did not care about funding any sort of research. So on one hand, AIDS research had to step up from previous cancer research. On the other hand, it had to step down from the fact that it took a very long time to get the attention and funding necessary. So it somewhat evens out in the end, but it's, if we had, when it first blew up, if there had been concerted effort, let's figure out what's going on with these people, let's fight it. They were at a really good point to do something about it. And so many lives could have been saved if it hadn't been a decade and a half, 2 decades delayed of actual real effort and attention going into this.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I did want to touch on I just almost missed it, the political sort of overtones to everything. And I can't even imagine what it would have been like for those people that were infected with this early on. Like, not only are you dealing with this, like, basically death sentence, but you're dealing with this sort of judgment from society that you somehow deserve it, or this is what you get. I mean, it's crazy to think about that people didn't have more compassion, or, it's just wild. There's so many facets to this beyond the virus portion of it. You know what I'm saying?
And people still don't have compassion for people that they see as different than them. That's the fact of the world. I think, fortunately, in today's day and age, people see others that are different than them as within their circles, as their neighbors, and so there is some empathy that is transmitted there. But there are innumerable examples of people just not putting the effort into caring about what happens to others that they see as completely separate themselves.
That's kind of all that I had. Is there anything else, like, you think we should cover with this? I feel like it was a really, really good discussion.
I think it's a great discussion. I'm sorry, it's not more like a mystery that we're kind of trying to pull apart. There's still a lot of things. I mean, it's a black box in a lot of different ways. We really don't know what happened and when. But I think you summed up well, which is to say, does this matter in today's day and age? And I mean, it's not like a missing person where it's like, well, let's find out what happened. Let's see if this person's still alive or get closure. It's something that we're still dealing with right now, and probably will be for a very long time, the continuing AIDS epidemic. But fortunately, we've got a handle on it right now. And despite the fact that we don't know what happened, we probably will never know exactly how it came about.
Yeah, and I think, no, I get what you're saying. And I also think, despite the fact we may not be able to pinpoint, the exact origin, I think it highlights you've highlighted a lot of things that maybe people don't know. Like, just like I didn't know that this, like, I didn't stop to think, like, before the 80s, the origin of this, like, it came from primates and it blew up in the 80s, but, like, all the other factors that went along with it, the political climate at the time, and then, like, the fact that it existed in impoverished nations before reaching a first world country, and that nobody really cared that much at that point. And then this Robert Rayford. I keep wanting to say Robert Redford, and that's the actor. This Robert Rayford kid, it's like, it's highlighting this person who would otherwise kind of go under the radar unless you bothered to look him up. And what kind of life did he lead? What kind of crimes was he a victim of at age 15? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So bringing that to light, I think, is worth it. And just bringing to light the fact that this existed in countries prior to the United States. Also, and then bringing to light the fact this poor man, this Gaetan Dugan, the French Canadian guy, who was for years vilified as being patient zero when it was literally like a typo and somebody just misunderstood. So my point is, I think all of those things bringing the education to people who may otherwise not bother to look into this is worth it, even if we don't know the exact origin.
I think that's true. I think you're right.
All right. Well, that's all I got, man.
Okay.
Thank you so much for talking about this. You bring a level of expertise and knowledge that I don't possess on the scientific part.
No. Yeah, happy to contribute. I'm not an HIV/AIDS expert, but I know a little bit about it. I know about the scientific principles that underlie it. So happy to for that conversation.
One minute and 43 seconds is dedicated to my number one fan. Thanks, Dad. I love you and I miss you. This podcast has been approved by Skipper the Cat. Right, Skippy?